That's the title. I'll move on to the baby picture. Um, I did turn 60 right about when I gave that talk last summer. I was born at 11:30 in the morning in Massachusetts, and it was about 5:30 in the afternoon. And my partner came to the talk and was in the audience, and I got to introduce him, which was great. So this is me at 3 months old. I look more like my baby picture than most people do. And my friends laugh at this photo. And I grew up in Waltham, Massachusetts, about 10 miles from Boston. It's a kind of working class suburb. My father owned a machine shop, and I worked in it when I was 10 years old, putting pipes through, machines that would cut the radius down to a certain radius to the thousandth of an inch. And my mother was a school teacher, elementary school teacher. And so these are just pictures of them with my sister Lynn. Both my parents are gone. My father in 2015, my mother 20 years ago. I was raised Catholic. My mother was from an Italian family, and so that affected how I grew up, knowing that being gay was bad, being gay was wrong. Any kind of sexuality outside of marriage was wrong, and that's the way I was brought up. But I knew I was gay when this issue of Life magazine came out in 1972. So I would have been about 9.5 years old when I saw this, and this was a photo that was, if you're a young gay boy, that's sort of hard to take your eyes off of. But this is how in a way, I use this photo it's how I date when I first, realized I had, a sexual attraction for men instead of women. It's sort of hard to, how else would you know exactly when that was, remembering backwards. I also, around the same time, knew that I was really interested in science. This is me in the 1975 at the School Street Elementary Science Fair. My father did a lot of photography, kind of amateur photography, and had a enlarger in the basement to print photographs. And so I did a lot of that kind of work and did this science fair. The reason the picture on the right is there is because my sister sent me this photograph while I was in Prague, right around on my birthday, actually, in 2017. And I saw the photograph, and I immediately sent her a picture back of what I was wearing when I got the email about the photograph. And the shirt is not the same shirt, obviously, but apparently my fashion sense didn't change in almost 40 years. But I was really into science as a kid, into even in elementary school and certainly junior high school, and interested in math and chemistry, and biology later. And one of the things I want to highlight, I think probably all of us have had, if we're lucky, have had this experience where you have really great teachers in your secondary school that introduce you to science, all the different sciences. And these are 4 of my teachers. In fact, we gave Mr. Nelson this T-shirt and called him, because everybody called him Mr. Physics. I do want to highlight my math teacher on the left, who wasn't openly gay in the sense that we would use it now, as in he told us about it. But I know friends who had seen him in town holding his boyfriend or partner's hand in a hardware store. And we, as we were finishing high school and graduating, and we dropped by his house after a night out or something, after some award ceremony, something like that. And his partner was there, and everybody kind of took it in stride. I mean, looking back, it's almost surprising to me how nobody really seemed to mind or care. But we liked him very much, and it just going. And there were other teachers that we thought were gay that we had an inkling, but certainly nobody was out, and almost no students. This is I graduated high school in 1981. There were maybe a couple of kids who were sort of out, and they were the theater kids, and I was in the marching band, whatever. We didn't necessarily know them very well. And so, in those days, people didn't come out in high school. It was very rare. There were no gay student associations like that in high schools. Um, uh, Graduating high school in 1981. So this is me with my father and my sister with a bad haircut. Um, I graduated in 1981. In that summer is when the AIDS epidemic started, or at least when the first reports of it were in the New York Times, which I read all the time. And so this is the first report of AIDS beginning in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco in 1981. And if you can imagine, as an 18-year-old going to college, thinking, would I go to a gay student group? Would I, try to meet people? Then this epidemic happens, and so now it's dangerous to be gay. You could get a deadly disease. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know what the virus was for a couple more years. Not till 1983 was the virus discovered, and the idea of how it was transmitted was understood. And so I stayed kind of rigidly in the closet as a college student. There was absolutely no reason to come out. There was a gay student group, undergraduate group at Harvard, but it made absolutely no sense to go to that kind of group because, in those days, people were afraid to, be in contact with gay people because we're gay men, that you could catch this virus. Certainly early on, we didn't really know how it was transmitted, but even later when we did, there was certainly a lot of misunderstanding of how it was transmitted, and so people wouldn't want to share a meal with you or share a room, a dorm room or something like that. And so I stayed, very rigidly in the closet, but always watching. I met some of the people that were running the gay student group and kind of kept them at a distance. But I was watching very carefully to see how they were and who they were and how they acted. It was a very tough time. Starting college in '81, my freshman chemistry professor was Martin Karplus, who later went on to win the Nobel Prize in our field in 2013. He was later my PhD advisor. He essentially taught us his textbook. This is a upperclassman textbook for juniors or seniors. But he, basically gave us this outline of chemistry, starting with one electron atoms, many electron atoms. Well, actually, particle in a box, one electron atoms, many electron atoms, hydrogen two, helium two, triatomics, and ended the semester with the simulation of a protein. So this is, again, the late 1981. The first, MD programs for proteins were in the late 70s. And so this was very early on. We got to see how our protein moved. And it inspired me because it, just like my high school teachers did, that you could go all the way from basic mathematics and physics to chemistry, all the way to biology. And of course, little did I know that I thought, oh well, basic theoretical physics is going to theoretical chemistry is going to solve all of biology. Obviously, that's not true because there's much more complexity that simulations are even now not really able to completely address. But it excited me, to a great extent. As an undergraduate, I did some teaching in math, and also in the chemistry department, I was a TA for teaching assistant for the undergraduate physical chemistry lab course. And the work that I did, I actually worked for Martin Karplus as an undergraduate in my junior and senior year. I started with a professor called Veronica Vida. She was the only woman in the department at that time, the only woman ever in the chemistry department at that time, and started in her lab doing experiments and summer after sophomore year. And then she didn't get tenure, and I sort of transitioned to Martin's lab because I was doing some working on some molecules in the lab that he was interested in doing calculations on. And so this paper arose out of that. It's actually my first paper in the Journal of Chemical Education. Graduating in 1985, I managed to get a fellowship to the University of Cambridge in England. And I did that. I tried very hard to do that. I had to apply for a couple different fellowships. And I was lucky to get one that Harvard was giving out specifically. So it wasn't a national one. Because I knew I wanted to come out. I knew that I had to go someplace far away from my parents. And rather than wanting to go to graduate school right away, and I'd gotten into Stanford, I probably would have gone to Stanford because I would not have wanted to stay in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My parents lived 10 miles away. And I really just wanted to get out of it. I really had to go someplace else. And so this is me graduating from college. And then this arriving in Cambridge, England, and this is punting on the Cam River. And, it was there that, I started the process of coming out. I went to some gay student groups, but I didn't realize just how afraid I was, and how I didn't want to be gay, and I didn't want anybody to know, and I was afraid of the AIDS epidemic, and I was still thinking, if I have sex with anybody, I'll get sick and die. And so over that first year, I was in the chemistry department there, and studying theoretical chemistry. I began to get sort of increasingly depressed. I by the spring of that year, I was pretty non-functional as a scientist. I couldn't think. I couldn't. And if you can imagine how, somebody who's a good student in college and all their lives, and suddenly that is taken away from them because of this transition to coming out, which I couldn't deal with. I got very, very depressed and basically nearly suicidal. I would walk around the roof of the chemistry department thinking, well, this is a place I could jump off of. And that was sort of in the late spring of 1986. And my parents were very flustered. They had no idea what was going on because I wasn't communicating. What saved my life is this, sorry, is this woman on the upper left. Her name is Julia. She was another graduate student in the college that I was in. And she started to wear a pink triangle. This is the pink triangle that she wore on the lower right. And I was sitting in the common room. You have to sort of imagine this like Harry Potter sort of college common rooms. And she was wearing the triangle, and she said, well, do you know what the triangle means? And I said, yeah, I wish I had the guts to wear one. And she said, oh, we should talk. And so we started to talk, and we'd had many similar experiences of being closeted and not being able to deal with it and being depressed and just finally needing to do something, or it was going to go very badly wrong. And so her suggestion to me was, well, and this was like I think the first or second day I knew her. She said, well, there's a garden party in the college on July 11th. And this is the invitation that I found yesterday as I was looking through some stuff. And she said, you can wear the pink triangle. Everybody here knows what it means because she'd been wearing it for weeks. And so I did. I went to this garden party and came out to a lot of people. And some couple of graduate students said, oh, it's a pink triangle. And I said, oh, it means I'm gay. And they said, oh, that's nice. How's your work going? I mean, everybody took it very casually. What happened, though, was that my close friends that I knew at Cambridge were not at the party. And this man here is Professor Hugh Hunt. He's a professor at the University of Cambridge, Australian man who, this is him now, lived in the house that I lived in, the college house that I lived in right next to me. And he was probably my closest friend there. And so I had to go back to the house and tell him about, having just come out to everybody, because I feel like he was going to find out. I really needed to tell him. And so I told him, and he said, oh, I thought you just didn't like living in England. He was an Australian who wasn't that comfortable living in England. And that's why you were depressed. And I said, no, it was because I wasn't coming out. And he didn't want to have like a really emotional conversation about my experiences, but he said, what are you doing later? And I said, I'm just going to hide in my room because I'm embarrassed, or I've done this big thing and it's just too much. And he said, no, meet me at the college bar, at 9:00. And I said, I can't. I don't want to be in public. And he said, just do it. And it remains to this day a hard thing for me to talk about because it was one of the kindest things anybody's ever done for me. He seemed to realize intuitively that I was embarrassed and ashamed, and that I shouldn't be, and that I should just go out in public like a normal person, like any person would. And he was there to help me do that. So after that, what Julia's advice was, stay here another year in Cambridge, put your life back together, put your head back together, and get back into work and get back into science. And that's what I did. And I ended up the second year I did undergraduate work in biochemistry, which is my first introduction to biology and biochemistry. Julia and I started this group called the Cambridge Lesbian and Gay Graduate Society. starting in the fall of 1986. That's our poster. And the other thing I did that actually was really important was this is the Cambridge Gay Group. This was a town group, not necessarily affiliated with the university, although there were a lot of university people in it. And a couple of these guys, this guy on the lower right was a physicist. The guy right here that I'm pointing to is a chemist. And there I am, and there is this guy that I dated for a little while. My second year was the first person I actually got involved with. But these people were scientists, and they were at the university, and they were, happy and going about their lives perfectly in a perfectly normal and average way. And that helped tremendously for me to interact with other scientists who were gay. And the fact that I had not really encountered any out gay scientists in my life up to that time. And so that was an important step in being able to get to know other people. And it showed me that the role of being out in science or in whatever educational institution I might find myself in, that how helpful that was in my transition to being a depressed, closeted 22-year-old to out and gradually accepting adult. We started going to marches. We started wearing pink triangles. This is a picture in 1987. We protested in front of the Houses of Parliament because of the very anti-gay Thatcher government. And so, I spent 2 years there, and that was the coming out period. And then I was capable of making a transition to graduate school. Right. So now, having spent 2 years in Cambridge, I felt like, well, I can go back to Harvard, even if my parents are 10 miles away. I wasn't out to them yet, but I could still, it was possible to go back there rather than having to feel like I had to go to California or I had to go to some other state in order to be away from them. And so I started graduate school in the fall of 1987 at Harvard. And this was the first professor I encountered. This was Don Wiley, who's a crystallographer. And he was the head of the biophysics program that I was in. And I found this quote as I was looking for things on him this week. And he says, "I'm sorry, but I just don't understand anything in biology unless I know what it looks like." And he had just published in the weeks that I started, first weeks that I started graduate school, this paper on the structure of the human class 1 histocompatibility antigen. And this is a protein involved in the immune system. It's expressed on almost all human cells. And the structure basically looks like this. There's a groove up here between these two helices that binds peptides. That the cell gets infected by flu, the flu proteins get chopped up into pieces, and they get put on the surface of this protein and put on the outside. And then there's a T cell floating around with a T cell receptor that will interact and kill that cell. That process wasn't really understood in October of 1987. And this is one of the structures in the history of structural biology where when you see the structure, suddenly you understand how the system works. And so there were hints about that infected cells could get killed off by the immune system, but exactly how they were recognized and how the information that the cell was infected was presented to the immune system wasn't understood at all. And so in that early structure, they saw, they knew the structure sequence of the protein. There was density in this binding site that was later figured out to be peptides. This was a mix of peptides in the first samples that showed that this is how the immune system presents cells. And so Don said to me very early on, he said, well, you computational folks think you're so smart. Why don't you predict the structure? We're doing the structure of a couple of other of these genes. They're very polymorphic. HLA-A and HLA-B proteins. And why don't you do that before we determine the structures? Well, in the long run, I didn't do it before they determined those structures. But these sequences are very similar to each other. There's only 10 or 20 amino acid differences between one gene and another gene, or one person's HLA-A gene and another person's HLA-A gene. This is basically a side chain problem. And this is how I got involved into looking at protein side chains. At the same time, we were reparameterizing the charm force field, charm 22 force field, and my amino acid, I was in charge of proline. And we talk about sometimes gay people not wanting to be LGBTQ people wanting to be part of everything, but being reluctant to. And I had to kind of ask to be part of this project because I wasn't initially chosen to be part of it, because I really wanted to belong. I really wanted to be part of the team. And so I got assigned to do proline. And I, in fact, did my first statistical study of protein structure, of peptide structures in the CCDB. And one thing you can see here is that the phi dihedral changes, the chi2 or chi1 or chi2 changes. That at this value, it's all minus 30, and up here it's plus 30. So there's it's a, the peptide, the ring of proline either goes like this or it goes like this. And I realized pretty quickly that the phi dihedrals, phi and psi dihedrals, and I did lots of quantum mechanics on this problem, and came up with the parameters that are still in use actually in CHARM on how to handle the proline peptide. So they're handled differently than other amino acid types. But there was a statistical aspect to it, and then there was a backbone dependence of the rotamer conformation. And so that observation, as I began to try to figure out, well, how am I going to predict the structures of these HLA proteins, was the origin of the backbone-dependent rotamer library for proteins. It's the conformation of the side chain, which rotamer is chosen, is different depending on the phi and psi of the local back dihedrals. I was lucky enough to be sitting in a lecture of Stuart Schreiber, just as an auditor, who explained the kind of conformational preferences of organic molecules that led to this second paper on how we explain why the conformational preferences are the way they are. And very quickly, that is because if you look at the molecule pentane, has an energy of 0 if it's trans and trans, the two dihedral angles. It's about 0.9 kilocalories per mole if one of them is Gauche plus, G plus. Remember the staggered dihedral angles of sp3 bonds. If they're both G plus, it's 1.8. But if one's G plus and one's G minus, you get this kind of ring-like shape, and the energy jumps up to 3.5 kilocalories per mole. What that means is that certain atoms, if they're too close together, will raise the energy quite a bit higher. I'm going to show, actually, I'm going to skip to the backbone dependent version of this. And it turns out you just have to count 5 atoms. So if you count from the C gamma atom, let's try the C gamma when it's in the G plus conformation. C gamma, C beta, C alpha in the back, the nitrogen, and the carbonyl carbon of the previous residue. Or if I count the other way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the oxygen of the same residue, or the nitrogen of the next residue. Those are atoms whose positions are phi and psi dependent relative to the position of the C gamma atom, which is chi1 dependent. And so there were certain combinations of chi1 and phi and psi that are forbidden. And you can see that in the Ramachandran distributions of each, say for lysine, for the G plus rotamer, that what I've marked here are the atoms that would conflict with the gamma carbon. I won't go into this in any more detail. We have a website that explains all of this. So going back to kind of gay and queer stuff, we used a lot of symbols in those days. I mean, we still, obviously we still do, to demonstrate or to tell people that we're gay or to express a political point of view. So here's just a sampling of those and things that we were wearing in the 80s and 90s. One of those things, as the title suggested, is a pink triangle. And the pink triangle was important because it really was, it was the rainbow flag. It was actually started in 1978, but it wasn't really in that much common use in the 80s. The pink triangle was, used by the Nazis. They forced gay men to wear them, and about 100,000 gay men were killed, as were many trans people, in the Holocaust. And it was a symbol of defiance. It was a symbol of, in the 80s, we've been persecuted. You think you're persecuting us, but we're going to wear it ourselves and use it as a weapon against the kind of discrimination or the kind of things that we were up against in the AIDS epidemic, when homophobia got much worse than it had been even in the 70s because of the AIDS epidemic. And so, we're on marches. This is the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Caucus, the Alumni Association. I think this might have been one of the AIDS walks that we were at in the 1990s. I was also a resident tutor in the chemistry department for chemistry and biochemistry in one of the undergraduate dorms. Harvard had graduate students living within the dorms as kind of resident advisors to the students. And I was the gay and lesbian issues tutor, and we actually had a bashing a student that was beaten up, and some major tasks to help. One of the things I did as the assistant senior tutor there was to have an evening where I talked to all the other tutors, all of these graduate students, and kind of present this life story of coming out, much the way I have today, um, and including all those stories that I've just told, and to explain to them what being gay was like, how how do you grow up as a gay teenager or young adult and begin to feel like you can come out and tell people, and so that helped this group of advisors to help our students deal with their sexuality. I wrote some articles. There was an article in the gay community news in Boston that HIV was not the cause of AIDS, and that it was just by and this is in the gay community news, so written by a gay man who wrote all this nonsense about what HIV was like. And if you see what happens with COVID, the same kinds of things are happening now. But I took to using my expertise as a biologist, biochemist, to try to combat that kind of nonsense that we were seeing. I did some other political things. There were some arrests in a men's room for sexual activity, and the gay community leaders in the university, kind of fought back and met with the police and tried to teach them how horrible it was to go as far as arresting people rather than just shooing people out of the room or putting up signs or having some patrols. They arrested people. One man committed suicide because he was outed in the newspaper. And so we kind of established a relationship with the police to try to educate them. And it was actually very instructive. I mean, they told us about their lives and we told them about ours. And together we kind of changed some policies at the university. Another thing I did was I was part of the AIDS Action Committee, and I trained volunteers. And this is where science meets sexuality, I guess, is I would give a 3-hour lecture actually to two new volunteers of the Boston AIDS Action Committee, and basically started with this first handwritten overheads on an overhead projector about DNA makes RNA makes protein, and all the way explaining to what T cells were and what the virus was, how transmission occurred, things like that. And it was very rewarding because I had people, men come up to me and say, well, now I know what's going on in my own body. Now you've explained to me what this virus is doing to me and how. I'm going to skip some things. This is graduating. These are 3 guys that I had, good relationships with, dating relationships with in graduate school. And here is my mother meeting them. And she sort of knew, I mean, I had come out to her a couple of years earlier, which had gone okay. She was worried about my health and worried about my safety, but basically okay. But she wasn't willing to meet them. She wasn't willing to talk to them. But at graduation, she kind of had to. And it all went fine, but it was a scary day. I was postdoctoral fellow at UCSF. I moved to San Francisco because I thought, well, that's where the gay people are, and there was a good group I could join there. And I had relationships there. It was a very scary time with AIDS in San Francisco at that time, and so it was a difficult place to live for a while. But ultimately, I felt like I wanted to be back on the East Coast. That's where I grew up. And so I moved back to East Coast, Philadelphia, in 1997. It was one of the 3 jobs in the country in computational structural anything in 1996. One of them was in Galveston, Texas. And as a gay person, I just didn't feel like that was a place that I would be safe or that I wanted to live in. And I was very lucky that Fox Chase hired me. So I've been there for 25 years. I have a bunch of slides that I think I'm running out of time here, are just about the work that we've done. One thing I've done is, partly to be part of the center and to contribute to cancer research, is that we've used molecular modeling with my colleagues. We have a molecular modeling facility where I've done this work for more than 25 years and about 80 different papers that I've published with my colleagues, basically using protein structure prediction to help biology. And of course, everything has changed in the last few years with AlphaFold, and now we're making, now we have like 25 projects going, whereas we used to have sort of 5 or 10 at any one time. The world has changed a lot quite recently. And this is just some of the work I've done over these years. We were the CASP assessors. We worked on protein interfaces and assemblies, and structural bioinformatics behind that. Antibody CDR conformations, including antibody design, but pre deep learning. So this is sort of old-fashioned Rosetta type work, and a lot of work on kinases, and particularly important in a cancer center where they're the targets of many drugs. And then finally, just a few slides on my research group, who've been so important to me. And I've come out to them kind of slow. I mean, in the early years, I probably wasn't out to them. I was out to colleagues. But Facebook, in, I don't know, I guess the late 2000s, I was pretty out there, and some of I never friended my students, but if they friended me, that was fine. I would friend them back. And some of them found out that way. And they've always been super accepting. This is my group over the years. This picture down here is I sing in an LGBT chorus called Philadelphia Voices of Pride. And here, four of the guys in my lab came to one of my concerts. And so they've always been pretty open and accepting of me. And one way, and I think we'll maybe talk about this later, is that social media has made a huge difference. Now having a Twitter profile where I have a rainbow flag instead of a pink triangle, rainbow flag in my bio. I post a lot about LGBTQ issues. What's on the right this is the Philadelphia Pride flag, actually from 2018 or so. The city of Philadelphia actually commissioned a design that included brown and black stripes to include the racial diversity of our community. And this is called the Progress flag in the lower right, which includes the colors of the trans flag. And so this is kind of the most inclusive symbol, although I don't know that you can get it as an emoji. But I like to be as out as possible on Twitter. I've had a number of students write to me from countries like Iran and Ukraine and variety of countries write to me and say, it's important to me that you're out. It's really helpful. And I've had conversations with them. So I continue to think that's a really important thing that we do. And then finally, this is my partner of 7 years, Sam Wallace. And so just a few pictures of us. So I think I will finish there. I think I've probably gone over.
That was a great presentation, Tom. Sorry, Roland.
Sorry.
Thank you very much for it. We have time for one comment or question. We are running a little bit over time, but it's fine. I mean, we don't stay within the rules because we are queer LGBT. So anybody wants to make a comment or question while we get Lorena set up? Perhaps I want to, I think there's a chat. Thanks for sharing, such an inspiration. Yeah, I mean, it was very nice. You touch on very things. I think we can discuss things in more detail in the round table. It's very important, this about the emotional and mental burden of being part of the community, because we had to do activism. In my case, I remember every time I was sharing flats, moving to a new flat, I had to disclose myself to the people who were going to be my roommates or flatmates, because I wasn't sure I was going to be able to be myself. So it's not only doing science, it's really a lot much more. And I think your talk is very interesting to put that into the table, so our allies also are aware of these things.
There were times when mental health issues impaired my work. I mean, first time in England, but also even as a postdoc. I got there and didn't know anybody, and AIDS was still really present. And was I going to meet people? Was I going to date? I went through a period of depression, and eventually had to tell my boss, my postdoc advisors, about being gay, and then I was going through a depression, and then I was getting therapy and getting help and getting better, and that took time. But I was, I guess, lucky to be able. I had people, advisors that I trusted with that information. Not everybody is that lucky. Maybe it was naive to trust. No, it wasn't naive to trust them. They were both great. But I didn't know how they would take it, and they were both really kind and supportive.